Um, and yes, we generally touch on multiple points of interest for data science within education. Because of these, I've tried to go wide rather than going deep in terms of, I guess, you mentioned, Simon, that some people have presented specific analysis in depth. This is going to be more trying to cover all the different parts of the company that are affected by data, which is most of them, turns out. And also to, to just hear your opinions on how you do all of this. The one restriction I have is I might not be able to share real data purely because of privacy reasons. We've recently become a publicly trading company with within a larger group. So I'm quite restricted in showing actual data, but I will try to showcase where that data comes into place, what kind of analysis turn to be most important, and what kind of insights have been extracted from there and are useful to bring on table. I will start by, as Simon said, giving a bit of background where I come from, just so that you can get a better idea of what I can bring to the table. I did start in the biotech space, in the healthcare space. I'm not going to lie, it was simply because it was the only degree that offered both engineering and medicine, which are two fascinating areas in my opinion. But then from there, it was really the more computational aspect of it that proved very engaging. And it may be as simple a reason as when you're in biology and you try to obtain any insight, it's weak of cultivating cells. But when you're working in the informatics, mathematical modeling, and data side of it, these insights are much more rewarding, and that loop of finding information, because that's at the end of the end what you that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to find those insights that are going to allow you to understand better the space that you're working with. So data is really a fast track way to do these things, just through computation. And after rolling around in bioinformatics and computational biology in Edinburgh, I finally ended up joining Sumdog. I say my title is data guy. We're a small team. We don't have like a massive data team where we've got people specializing in different aspects. It's a small data team supporting an Edtech company, which means that I do most of it, from the business intelligence to data analysis to the infrastructure and data engineering, data capturing as well. So in that sense, it also fits the theme of this conversation that I want to bring it into, of trying to enrich with all different aspects within a company. And particularly, I guess, the reason I want to use these case study of Sumdog as a company is because when I arrived to Sumdog, this was roughly three and a half years ago, they were not really data driven. They were collecting this data, but they were not leveraging it in any way. So it's a journey that also serves as a proxy on an instruction manual on how to get a company that is not data driven and slowly incorporate data into more and more and more aspects of this company. Now, since it's Sumdog that we're going to use as a case study, let me just give you a quick snapshot into what Sumdog is. Kevin was asking a moment ago whether Sumdog is anything like Khan Academy. I guess Sumdog is like Khan Academy in the same way that an apple is like an orange. They're both trying to accomplish the same thing, and they're the same kind of educational software, with the difference that Khan Academy is perhaps more a repository of knowledge that people access. Funnily enough, Sumdog used to have Khan Academy videos some years ago to explain some topics. But if that is more a repository of information, data, knowledge, Sumdog is more an interactive tool for students, teachers, and parents to guide the education journey of that kid, to adapt to their needs, to support them, and also at the same time empower those teachers to give the best service to the students. If you feel curious about it, feel free to join yourself at learn.sumdog.com. You'll see perhaps not the inside of the ad, but you'll definitely find some good information there. But the way I like to start describing SumDoc is through its mission, which has since the beginning been to narrow the attainment gap between students. I'm sure a lot of you are already aware of that attainment gap between the top achievers and the students are at the bottom of this gap. And it's in a way discouraging that since the pandemic, there's been multiple indicators that these progress is kind of going backwards in a way. So it really feels like the moment to double down on that effort and try to force that gap into narrowing again. How we do this, as I say, it's personalized learning is a big part of SumDoc, where the first thing that a student will do once they join is they will take an assessment and diagnostic test, and that will place them in a particular rank within their curriculum. And then from there, they will keep practicing the skills of the curriculum that they're studying. But it will be different for any student, regardless of where they are there. And it's particularly useful for students that may have been behind, say, a year 4 student which is still struggling with concepts from year 3. It's really useful to go and rescue those concepts back and bring them in line with the rest of the class. The second big strength that I would mention about SumDoc is gamification and making learning engaging for pupils. We all know that maths, particularly, which is a subject that SumDoc focuses on, even though it also offers grammar and spelling, it's a daunting subject for students, and it sometimes is so more at a psychological level than actually didactic level. So making it fun for them kind of destroys that barrier. And finally, the parties using the platform to support not only the students, but also the teachers involved in a way. Teachers have been stretched at capacity for a time now. They're really overworked demographics. So any way in which we can make their time more efficient, and just things like allowing them to spot where the class needs some effort or making practicing with their class a bit easier, that's something that I also feel particularly proud of. Some quick facts so you can put SumDoc, if you don't know it already, in the scene on what kind of company it is, in case you're trying to compare methodologies or perhaps to your own case of your company. SumDoc is used, it's a small medium enterprise based in the UK, in Edinburgh, and it's used by hundreds of thousands of students every month. These students are all around the globe. Our 3 biggest markets that I'll focus on are the UK, England, and Scotland. And yeah, it offers both. It's relevant that it's international in the sense that we align to the different curricula, and those are very much country or region specific, to the point where even England may be working with more than one curriculum. And in this sense, the last thing that I'll mention is that we've got an offering both for, instead of B2B, that is supporting schools and teachers, but also an individual option for parents to support their own children within education. That being said, let's take this case and see how you can turn a company that is not particularly data-driven in which one that has data embedded in its day-to-day life. And the first thing that we're going to need to achieve that is, well, some data. In my case, in the case of many companies within tech space, you are already gathering some data just for the normal functioning of your product. The thing is that this data is oftentimes just sitting there unleveraged. And I say that I'm aware that this might not be your situation if your company is not within the tech space or that doesn't have a detail offering, in which case you need to extract the data and measure it ad hoc for what you're trying to do. But in this case, we're starting from a wealth of data that is just used towards the purpose of providing this service. So let's say you get those initial databases with all of your data that are used for a product, and you start by something as simple as making a read replica, and you merge it all together into separate database or data warehouse. And there you started your for the moment very small data center that you can use to then work on. If you then combine that replica with some other platforms that you might be using, it's not uncommon for a company to use other platforms like CRM systems, customer relationship management systems, then that's another sort of data that and we'll touch on how this integration is quite useful later. But let's say you're already here, you can now call it a data warehouse since you aggregate data from different sources. You continue adding other providers that you're using in the company, say payment providers. And then you can take an extra step, which is when things start becoming really interesting, in my opinion, which is once you add government data. There's a wealth of data that the government itself provides about schools, particularly all of data that is not necessarily related to, in this case, Samsung itself, that is your own platform. Things like knowing what kind of schools are using your platform, things like something as simple as socioeconomic measures. We recently had a situation in which we wanted to offer our product to more struggling students free of cost, and this is something that you cannot do unless you've got access to this data. Granted, this is another entire kind of worms on how you define disadvantage, how you define deprivation, particularly when it's across different countries. But in my opinion, very useful to be able to contrast the school characteristics with what the students are doing in your platform, to further inform in this conversation. And then the final output of all of this data that you are going to have is in terms of both reporting and analysis. And I want to differentiate this in terms of analysis will be a more data analysis, data science-y side of things, where you're taking your data and then you're processing it to obtain a particular insight. Whereas reporting, I mean it more in the sense of getting that data and making it accessible and visible to the right people that are going to benefit from it and the right format. And more as a business intelligence, perhaps, or basically there's not that much processing going on. You're just trying to give visibility to some metrics that are going to aid both internal staff from the company and external users for different reasons that we'll touch on. Now let's focus on how to use this data that we've now got into making the company data driven. And I'm not saying that you need to get to this point before doing anything at all. The moment you've just got your production data, you can very much start producing very interesting insights. But of course, the more you get in terms of data, the more you can combine and the more insights you unlock. Anyway, what I want to do now is let's dive into the inner workings of an edtech company. But I want to remind that feel free to ask any questions throughout the entire presentation. Don't feel that you're being disruptive. And if it's something that is a longer discussion, we can just move it towards the end with provision a bit of time to then have some debate about any point that was particularly interesting. But without further ado, let's start looking at a company, and we're going to start by looking at its product. And when I mean its product, I really want to tackle it from the point of view of a customer that starts using the product and hopefully will keep doing so and keep benefiting from it for a good while. And these classifications that I've got on the left, I don't claim any credit for that. That's quite a classic classification. I'm taking this one from a recent talk given by Spotify, which in a sense is similar. It's not within the edtech, but it's one of the tech giants that offer a similar kind of product. And they divide this customer journey in three key parts. One is the onboarding phase, which would be the first week since you start using product. Then you move on into the first month, and then the final part of the full acquisition journey, they give it 6 months, 180 days for it, to which I've decided to add one fourth stage, which is your user that has been consolidated, which is very much not to be forgotten about. And the key here is that each of these phases have something particular that you're trying to achieve with your user, but also have some specific data that is going to be relevant to it in terms of aiding these users and your own company in achieving their objectives. For the first 7 days, that onboarding phase, what you just want to do is for the user to finish the entire onboarding so they are in a position where they can start using the product without trouble. And for these kind of analysis, the most useful tool that I found is that kind of funnel chart on the right. By the way, those are not real numbers. They aren't even real stages. I'm not allowed to share real data, but it's very much a representation of how this kind of funnel chart would work, in which you are trying to count how many users are reaching each of the journeys, each of the stages of this journey. And you're doing this with the intention of finding what are your pain points, what are the parts of the process at which the user is getting stuck, in order to identify areas for improvement towards a product. So you will get, for any time period that you study, this kind of funnel chart for each of the stages. You will study the conversion rates from each of the stages into next stage, and ultimately what's the ratio of those coming in, probably representing something like users starting your platform, and those coming out of the funnel, which will probably represent something like onboarding finished, this user is ready to benefit from the features. And these ratios themselves, I really like them because in a way they are, because precisely the ratios, they are less dependent on external factors. So they're more internally robust, in the sense of, I don't have that much control over how many people are signing up. It may depend on acquisition expenditure. It may depend on the time of the year. For example, a lot of users will join on the beginning of the year, or perhaps in September when the new school year starts. It will depend on many external events. But the proportion of those users that reaches each of the stages of your product, that is quite a bit more invariable. And let's say the second aspect to this graph will be to get those same ratios and then plot them throughout time. And it's very satisfying to see those ratios evolve throughout time in a very steady way. And only after you've introduced a product improvement, you see that rate going up. And it's very distinct because of how little it varies with everything else. And it's very satisfying because of that. So what you do is identify that point that you want to improve upon, and then measure how much you're actually improving in terms of these conversion rates. The next two phases, the first 30 days and the first 180 days, are when the user is starting to discover the features and it's starting to get comfortable with the features. During those first 30 days, you just want to showcase what the user can do so they can decide what's useful for them and how they plan to incorporate the product into their teaching or that of their kids. And what you will want to do in this case is measure what features of your product the user is interacting with. And again, this is guided towards improving your product, into identifying what things are not being used, and determine, are they not being used because the product is not good? Are they not being used because there's not that much demand on it? And on the flip side, identify those parts of your product that teachers are benefiting the most from. And if the aim of these first 30 days to discover those features, the aim of the next 6 months is to get them to really form a habit with them, get comfortable with those features, and incorporate it in the day-to-day living. So if you were measuring whether they interact at all with these features, what you're measuring now is how often they do so, or what of these features are part of their daily routine. This is particularly useful in the case of Samdot, which is, it's a wide platform that can provide different benefits to a teacher. And I'm talking, some teachers use it as a core driver of the class. Some teachers want to use it for just practice work at home or to set homework. Some teachers prefer to use it to reinforce specific content or to identify flaws. So depending on what profile of that user, you will find that there's different features that fall into the repertoire. But in a way, these two phases are similar into what you're measuring and then measuring how often they're being used. And finally, you arrive to that consolidated user, which is the user that is already comfortable with the platform, is familiar with the platform, and what you're trying to measure, and you measure here in terms of churn, in terms of how many users abandon the platform, because at the end of the day, it's a measure of how solid your end product is and how comfortable users become with. But we'll talk about each of these phases in a bit more detail. Specifically about that second and third phase, and we're talking before about how we leverage gamification for learning. There's this framework that we use called Octalysis. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that one before, but it was a framework that was developed in order to apply these kinds of gamification towards driving engagement. In our case, engagement translates into learning done by students on the platform. And the way this Octalysis works is, as the name suggests, it breaks down your product into 6 different aspects, or let's call it better, drivers, that are going to keep the user engaged and wanting to come back to your product. And when you say engage, again, I mean keep kids wanting to learn with Sumdog. And there's all these 8 different drivers. You've got anywhere from that sense of, we try to tackle all of them, that sense of meaning, for example, in terms of we've got contests and competitions that are used to bring that motivation to the student. We've got that sense of accomplishment that we achieve by rewarding these students with coins to spend on the platform once they are learning. We or even leaderboards. But there's this broad classification of these Octalysis into 2 categories of drivers. One of them are the so-called white hat drivers, which are, I like to see as positive encouragement. You are driving them towards something, that sense of meaning, that accomplishment. In terms of empowerment, the best example I've got is parents. Parents are not that data savvy. They're not very, they don't even familiar with curricula, but just knowing that they can check where their kid is using the app, whether they're progressing, that gives a feeling of empowerment over a situation that would otherwise be very much outside their control. And then we've got those black hat drivers, which are, they are like seen as negative motivation, as being engaged because of wanting to avoid losing something. We gotta be very careful here, because let's not forget it's kids that we're talking about, and that's why our platform, it skews towards those white hat drives. We don't have that much in terms of that avoidance, but it's still possible to leverage it in a positive way. For example, one feature that we released recently was special items that kids can only unlock if on a given week they practice for at least 20 minutes on the platform, which is a number that we've determined it's promotes the advancement of their academic path. And it is negative in that they will try to come back, to avoid missing the item that they want, but at the same time it is still quite positive, and the end result is they're spending more time learning, which is what we want. Coming back to data, I realized that I went a bit stray. What you want to do here is to measure, because each of these drives will relate to specific features in your product. I was saying maybe accomplishment relates to earning coins and spending them. Social influence on our platform is well represented by features of friendship and students being able to send gifts to each other to encourage each other. So what you want to do is have data available about the interaction of users with this data. In my mind, and this is not exactly the way that we do it at Sumdog, because as I say, most of the data was already there for the product. But if I was to just measure this specifically, I think event-based data, where you're just recording every interaction between each user and each of these features, is very helpful and very powerful in measuring these 2 middle stages of the journey of a user. And finally, I want to go back to that last point and take a look at consolidated users. And I thought this was a good opportunity to introduce how data is also used towards driving the revenue of a company. Because let's not forget, he's a product company, and I'm assuming that at least some of the audience is in a similar situation and want to learn how we do things about it. So in terms of revenue, the way I see it is you've got these consolidated users that are already on the platform. And these form a customer base with a number U of users. And then in terms of strictly revenue, each of these users produces with some regularity, be it monthly, being yearly, depends on the subscription, nature of the subscription, will generate a recurring revenue. What we use in order to predict those calculations and estimate these models is two metrics. One is that ARPU, which corresponds with is the average revenue per paying user, how much every user is paying a month. And you're also studying how many users are leaving your platform, which is a churn rate. Let's say it could be 10% of your users leave on a given month, for example, to use a round number. And in a way, what you want to do is estimate how much revenue you are going to obtain from any new user that joins the pool. And you do that towards budgeting how much you can spend on improving your product and on different parts of your company. The way you normally do this is multiply how much do I get regularly from every user by how long do I keep users around. Because how long do I keep users around is normally more an estimation, since you can know the current existing users that are on your platform, how long they're going to go for. You actually measure it as the inverse of that churn rate. If your churn rate is 10% a month, that means that 10% of your subscribers is leaving every month, but it also means that your average stay on the platform is 10 months. So you combine those 10 months that you're expecting with how much you're expecting to in revenue per customer, and that gives a solid indication about what you can plan for your users. But what's more important for me, and now we deviate a bit from purely financial metrics, is this customer base, that big pool of users, where you've got, there is of course an inflow and there is an outflow. And that outflow is what we discussed. It's a churn rate that is based on the number of customers that you have. It's a proportion of that customer base on a regular basis, monthly, yearly, but it also depends a lot on the quality of your product. I see it in a way as a bit like an employment figures, where you've got an absolute baseline that you're never going to call it structural churn, that you're never going to get under. And that is useful. People want to change what they do and want to try new things. But then besides that minimum, the thing that relates the most is how good your product is. And the better it is, the happier people will be, the more engaged they will be, and the longer they'll stay around. On the other hand, on the left-hand side, you've got those new users coming in. And it doesn't depend that much on the quality of the product, in the sense that until you tried, you don't know whether it's good. So by the time you know whether it's good, you're already halfway through that funnel that we were discussing. It's also way more dependent on external factors. For example, during the pandemic, there was such an incredible inflow of people wanting a solution for remote learning. And it's certainly not anything to do with us improving our products, just external circumstances. But perhaps the most interesting part of this I see is that it's quite linear in terms of perhaps you promote your platform so it has visibility for new users. If you're spending an amount X on promoting that platform and you jump into spending 2X, you're probably going to get twice as many users. So it's quite linear in that sense. The exception to this being word of mouth, which very much spreads around in a more exponential way. But the beauty on this is because you've got an inflow which is quite linear and you've got an outflow which is more akin to an exponential decay, you will find equilibrium at that point in which new users are exactly the same value as output or leaving or churn users. And with this combination of factors, it's really going to depend on your customer base, you, or the size of your company. And I'll take it to the extremes to represent what I mean. If you've got, if say you're a company with 10 employees where you've got 1 or 2 developers, any improvement to the product is going to be so costly, and is going to reduce the churn rate slightly, but for an already small customer base. Whereas if, let's say, you're Spotify, a small improvement to your product could be the equivalent of spending millions on new advertising. So depending where you are in that size scale, you will find a natural point, a resting point for where you want to take your budget and your resources into bringing new users or into improving the product for existing users. I want to now jump on. I see the product as the core aspect of a company. That's their offering. It's the heart of it. But there are many other aspects of a company that I want to touch on. Again, I'm trying to find interesting points of discussion, but it's other parts of the company that are very much gone to being not data-driven, to now data being fundamental for them. And every single section of the company does so in a slightly different way. I want to talk about communications. I'm not sure marketing is the right word, because a lot of the communications we do is towards existing customers, towards improving their experiences and helping them with anything that they may get stuck with. But it's also some of the communications are for external audiences. In this case, I want to focus on your customers, your users, and going back to that infrastructure diagram. I'm specifically talking about that little interaction between your CRM system, which is the one that you'll use to interact with your customers and to communicate with them, and your own source of data. And you will notice, if you've been keen-eyed, that in that previous diagram, the CRM system interaction with data warehouse is the one that is two-directional. In many cases, you're just trying to gather and agglutinate as much data as possible. This is one in which the CRM system will be a new sort of data, depending on what customers do when interacting with it, but it's mostly a recipient for data. There's only so many things. If you've got your CRM system with no extra data there, you just have an address book. You've got a list of emails and a list of names associated with those emails, and I wish you all the best in trying to make it relevant for anyone, because you don't know who's who. But if you start feeding that data, you curate it from your data warehouse based on what they do on the platform, based on where they're coming from, and you get that on your CRM system, that is going to improve a lot your communications. And the reason it's very important, in my opinion, in the Edtech space to nail this down is that survey that I've stolen from Teacher Tab. You may have recognized the format. It's the average number of emails that different categories of teachers or school personnel receive on a given day. I don't want to get in much detail. The message here is teachers are very busy people. And they normally overwork, and they don't have time to read a lot of emails that are not of any relevance to them. So the 3 things that I want to achieve with these data are to make it relevant, targeted, and considerate. When I mean relevant, it means don't just send an email promoting your platform. Make it relevant to the person that is being sent to. Include some data relevant to that person. Use it for something effective. It's got to be targeted, not just because that data you can include in the email itself, but because you can use that data to filter who you send it to. Mass communications, they tend to not work simply because it's difficult to make something relevant for everyone. Sure, the only thing they've got in common is that they're all using the platform, but every teacher is going to be different from each other. Every teacher is going to be trying to achieve something different. So you need to make the communications smaller and more targeted towards the right people. And what you achieve with these is simply being considerate towards them. I work in the Edtech space, but at the same time, I am a customer in my day-to-day life, and I've got that conflict of interest in terms of getting spam by emails. I'm sure that we all relate to. So in a way, it's quite important to avoid just bombarding people with those. when there's no need for that. And the way we achieve this is by capping the amount of emails that a given user will receive on a given month. Otherwise, you are going to end up with burnt out users from your communications, and that are simply going to become desensitized to them. To give a good versus bad email example here, one that uses these aspects of data versus one that doesn't use it. Let's say that we've released a new feature where you can get reporting on what parts of the curriculum your children are struggling with. A bad email, in my opinion, will be one sent to all your audience saying something like, hey, try Sumdoc's new feature. We all know we're going to delete that email because you get so many of them on your inbox. The way it's way more relevant, it's first, don't send it to everyone. Send it to the people that it's being released to. Send it separately to different kinds of customers that may have different interests. Second, make it relevant. Say something like, oh, it seems that 5 of your students are struggling with this particular skill, with rounding to the nearest 1,000, for example. And then you can also add something like, here is a new tool that is at your disposal to solve the situation. So rather than just requesting their attention, which is a limited resource, for nothing, you're only requesting as much attention as needed. You're helping them since the beginning identify a problem, and you're already offering a solution. And just to give some context, this is how we're doing things a few years ago, just not using data at all. And we were struggling with open rates and engagement on our emails. And there's no wonder. We're getting really low rates, less than, say, 20% of engagement. And then we simply started making them smaller and more targeted while using data to make it relevant to the recipient. And magically that jumps to more than 50%, more than 70%, depends on, which means that everyone is happier with the situation. Another small part of what we do that I want to draw some emphasis into is the curriculum. And I want to bring this up because I know that perhaps some of the audience comes from other parts of the edtech space or the companies, and depends on what your company does. It may or may not have this part of the problem where you're trying to align with specific curricula. Now, it's all good to align to this curriculum in terms of you want teachers to have the guidelines that they're familiar with. But there's a lot of curricula out there that everyone uses, and they're used differently on different regions. And it's very time consuming to design this curriculum. Just in England, for example, we've got national curriculum, but White Rose Maths is becoming more and more widespread. And actually, I'll be curious to ask if White Rose Maths is something that you've interacted with already, or it's something that hasn't come into your radar yet. So that's a good point of discussion. We've got Scotland, we've got Northern Ireland, we've got Wales. They each have their own curricula. And then the US is another entire kind of world where they've got the common core around, but because they are so, every state is quite independent, they've got their own curricula, not to talk about other countries that we operate in, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada. What I try to say here is that developing curricula, it's very intensive in terms of the resources and almost just the manpower that it requires. So the way that I found data fits here is, first of all, guide the design, give them some guidelines on how to develop this curricula. That study on the top right, again, I had to remove actual figures, but it's basically one in which we were measuring how much usage our pupils have against how much they progress through their particular curriculum. And this was done in order to guide our curriculum team in how much usage they can expect from a student in order to progress through curriculum, and therefore guide how they're doing, rather than just throwing something out there and having to correct later onwards. A comment on that, you'll see that there's a lot of dispersion. I'm not surprised by that in terms of every student is very different, and not all of the curriculum progression they do is through Sumdoc, but it still offered a very useful bracket in terms of how much you can expect from a student on your platform to progress through the curricula. And then all the things that you can do is you can locate what gaps you've got, areas that you're not covering. You can help identify anything that's outdated and that needs some work put into it. And you can also tie back to communication, use that to communicate those changes and those upgrades and this is a good example of the users of that curriculum are probably going to be very excited about it. And anyone who doesn't use that curriculum probably doesn't care at all about these new upgrades. So you can see how having data embedded in different parts of your business starts synergizing more and more and opening a whole realm of possibilities. Since we operate in different parts of the world with different curricula, I thought an area that could be of interest would be to compare the behavior of these different areas in terms of data and education. Now, I'm going to just focus on the US, England, and Scotland being the three largest market, and they're the ones that we normally compare. And both the education atmosphere and the data associated, of course, will be different. For example, on that first row, I want to refer there to what data sources you would use to find data related to education in those countries. And many of you will probably be familiar with the Department for Education in England. Scotland, as you are aware, is a completely different thing, and its data is managed by the Scottish government. And then you've got the US, where it's not even any centralized authority, and the closest you've got is the National Center for Education Statistics, which does a decent job of aggregating this data from all of their different schools. So those are good sources that you can start consulting if you want to expand into areas outside of England for your analysis. In terms of centralization and where that level of management occurs, it is quite different to study the UK and the US in terms of the UK tends to be a lot more centralized in terms of the guidelines are clearly set by each of the devolved countries and competencies. And then it's fairly consistent across the education space. The US is nothing like this. Every state, not even every state, every county within the state and every education district within each of those countries operates with a much higher degree of autonomy, which means that things may just happen differently, not to talk about calendar date where everyone follows, but the US is much more heterogeneous in terms of the data, and that is coming in part from the lack of such a centralization like we enjoy here. And also in terms of what entities, let's say, manage the education space or enforce its guidelines. In England, we've seen recently how maths are becoming more and more prominent within the education space, which again is another opportunity in terms of data because it's a group of schools that are going to be interested on the same insights. Scotland on its side, it's not big on maths, but it's still quite centralized at a local authority level. Whereas, as I was saying, in the UK and the US, it's the district that have quite a high degree of autonomy to work as they please. And then I wanted to, now that these bases are set, just share some insights. As I can share the actual data, although feel free to reach me if you're interested in that particular analysis, but just some insight that I found while comparing these different territories on a platform through the years. One of them is where the usage for online platforms takes place. And of course, online platforms, I mean, the case of Sumdog, but it will be good to get opinions in this if this is something that you've seen yourself in your respective fields or companies. Homework is not such a big thing in the UK, in the US, and it's becoming progressively out of the scene with the years. And this translates into, we see most of our, in England, for example, it's quite balanced the amount of uses that the students perform at school with their teachers than that which they perform outside the school hours at their home for reinforcing. Whereas the US is really nothing like this, and the vast majority of the usage and the learning that they do online happens at the school level while they are at class. And Scotland, you'll find that it's very much in line with England. It's a bit lower, so it's a bit more balanced, but it strives closer to England than it does to US. And the implication of this comes with what kind of devices are used for online learning, where on the one hand, some very solid insight that we found is that when you're using such a platform at your school, many times it's going to be on a desktop device, on a computer lab. Whereas if you're using an online platform at home, chances are that's going to happen on a mobile device, on your phone, on a tablet. So we've got that correlation. But the interesting thing is that even when you're controlling for home versus school usage, we still find that the US, it's much dominated by desktop devices. And I want to highlight, like, Chromebooks are a very big thing. Whereas UK, England and Scotland are more keen on using mobile devices, definitely at home, as I was mentioning, but even at school, it's much more balanced. There are many classes that use iPads with the students rather than going straight to a computer lab. So that's another important difference in terms of usage. I will add here that it has implications. For example, we found that the session length was slightly longer on desktop devices than on mobile devices. I'm yet unsure as what's the reason for this. Perhaps it's simply strain, or perhaps it correlates with what kind of usage where you want to get out of this. But it could mean that session lengths will vary depending on the region. And then, not surprisingly, as I was saying, homework, not such a big thing in the US anymore, is that our platform has two ways of operating. One is purely through adaptivity, where the platform presents the user with what work they want to partake in. And then there is the teacher set work, where the teacher decides, I want them to focus on this particular part of the curriculum, and sets work. In the US, that's less common. Students tend to just go with the native platform what it's offered, whereas here in the UK, we see a higher degree of involvement between teachers and the platform. And this leads me into one of the last things I want to touch upon, which is the different data user personas. In a way, if my job is to generate data and insights, these are my customers, these are the consumers of that data. And you've got both external consumers, you've got teachers, you've got parents, and then you've got different personnel at the schools, like head teachers, or even something like a math manager. But even when you want to support your own company, it's not the same data that a customer-facing team is going to need than top management is going to need. For example, a teacher will care about what their class is doing, what they're struggling with, whereas a head teacher will care about all of the classes in the school. And perhaps a math manager just cares about overall metrics in all of their schools without really caring about what each individual student is doing. And I think the way you separate these four personas, let's say you assign an attribute to each of these personas, is A, what's their motivation? And I'll perhaps use a teacher as an example. In this case, the motivation is to support the class and help them with their learning. What scale of the data? In this case, we're talking about just a class as opposed to perhaps multiple schools, or a single kid if you're a parent. What types of data? You're probably interested in that which is going to help you identify which spots that your students are struggling with. Or anything that points you towards better delivering your lesson. And also what level of data literacy. And I am the first person who gets very excited about all the different graphs that Seaborn comes with. But at the same time, if you're offering data to a parent, they're probably going to be familiar with bar charts, line charts, and perhaps a histogram. So you really need to tailor your reporting to the person that is going to be consuming that. There's just two small points that I want to touch on before finishing. One is user feedback. And I mean this in terms of user research, in terms of that other side of the coin, which is reaching people and talking to them and getting their feedback on what you may investigate. And it's really symbiotic relationship in which through data, you are going to uncover problems to solve, but you will often hit the problem in that the data normally ends where the person starts. And you can see the patterns and you can see what's happening, but it's hard to find what are the motivations for that to happen. So in that sense, it's useful to have a separate user research capability to then get in touch with them. And of course, it's going to be more qualitative data, but there's an entire spectrum there. In terms of what user feedback we collect, which is gold for us, just having an opinion of those who use the platform. Sure, you've got the very clean data you collected from product, or things like NPS service, where you get a little survey score from 1 to 5, or even something like hot feedback with text that you can submit. But then when you get into user testimonials, into even visiting a school in person, that is way more qualitative. It's analyzed with an entirely different set of skills, but I would not want to diminish that in terms of it often helps to put a face to the numbers. For example, there was this one school in which I was seeing data that they were not using Sum.Match after the school. And I went on a visit and I was talking to teachers. And our assumption, of course, was they're not very engaged or they don't like the platform. Turns out the students were getting home and then they couldn't use the platform until the parents came back and lent their phones. So yes, there is an entire separate realm and another half of the depth of the iceberg that you can go with that user research. But I would recommend these for tackling specific problems that you've identified through your more quantitative and expansive data analysis. And perhaps the last thing I want to touch on, just because I feel like I have, is data privacy. Because at the end of the day, it's children that we are working with, it's children's data. And well, on the one hand, they are classified as a vulnerable group. And I say this in the context of GDPR, which has become sort of all-encompassing. And also the fact that they don't have any knowledge about data protection. And what this means is that they're not themselves responsible for the safety of the data. Their parents are, and while they're at school, their teachers are, which means that parents, but particularly teachers, are going to be, understandably, very conscious about what's done with their data, and the decision to use or not your platform may come down to that. So understanding that teachers may have a concern for data, here's 3 specific suggestions, or more like considerations to bear in mind, to ensure that you're using best practice and then reassure the teachers about the security of the data. Perhaps the most important one is cybersecurity standards. In the UK, the government-sponsored program is Cyber Essentials, which is what we adhere to on Sandbox. And to be honest, it's been driven by schools themselves asking for it. There's all their standards like NIF, there's ISO standards, but it means that you are adhering to a robust set of rules. And it also means that you can reassure the teachers about what's being done with the data. It may also involve you having to go through DPAs, those are data protection impact assessments with schools to say and agree in advance how you're going to use the data. And even small things like where you're storing your data could have an impact. For those more data privacy conscious customers, they may, if here in the UK, but they may not be happy with the data being stored, for example, in the US. EU tends to be okay since it's a common framework of rules, at least for the moment. But just to throw that as another consideration to have, because to say data privacy becomes extra important when you're dealing with children's data. And with that being said, that's the walkthrough that I wanted to give you around SumDoc. I'm very interested to hear your opinions on any part of this, on the Edtech space in general, and on data companies. And what I'm going to do is first to thank you for your time and attention. Those are my contact details. Please feel free to reach about anything that you may want. And I'm now going to pass the hosting privileges back to Simon.
Hello, thank you so much, Francisco. That was really, really enlightening, and hopefully lots that people can gain from that. So I'm also an Edtech company, and I can see that, you know, there were some things I was like, oh yeah, we're doing that, but there were loads of highlights there that I thought, wow, we could do that a little bit better. I'm interested in the way that using data warehouses and some of those data cybersecurity things as well. Actually, I thought I should have a look at. Now, let me just bring the questions to the chat before I dominate things. There are some questions here in the chat. Elena, you have asked a couple of questions here. I wonder if you want to unmute and ask questions. By the way, people, you can now share your videos if you want to. I have enabled that.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, so good.
Yeah, sorry, I'm in the car.
Yeah,
my question was about, it relates to the slide about when you were showing the difference between the US and the UK, and I was wondering if you had seen a difference in age of device and browser, and if you had it in about whether it was changed since the pandemic.
Right. I've not specifically analyzed it pre and post pandemic, but I'd say there is a relationship in the type of devices that they use, with younger children being more leaning towards mobile devices. It's not a very strong relationship, but there's definitely a trend in that sense. And perhaps another thing to bring up is not just what kind of devices they're using, but the access to devices. Particularly in the UK, what I've seen is that many schools will have individual tablets for the older students, while the younger courses will have to just share their available devices, pool them across different students. That being said, I would also add that it's very much school dependent, in the sense of you may as well just have the younger children using the computer lab and therefore using desktop devices. That's the relationship that I've seen so far.
Thank you, Francisco. Diggory has a couple of questions. Diggory, do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, sure. So I'm at ED, and I build quite a few dashboards for reporting metrics. And yeah, I wondered how you account for the seasonality throughout the year. So you want students to be using it every week, but then every half term, every summer, that drops. And so it looks like your habitual users have disappeared.
That's actually a really good question, Diggory. It's definitely something that we've iterated around, because I don't think there's a perfect answer about it. For example, with usage, what we used to do is just weigh every week from a few previous years, get a reference, and then apply those weights to like normalize what you're seeing in the current year. That's definitely one option that we've used in the past. Because, as you say, there is a lot of seasonality, particularly with summer holidays being there. Then September goes crazy. So normalizing through weights is a good way to go about it. The other thing I'd say is what reference periods you use to compare your metrics. So, because I'm assuming any metric that you want there, most metrics are valuable in reference to a different baseline or another metric. So, for example, now we're setting OKRs for Q3. Q2 is about to end. What we do for those OKRs is each of those metrics will base our targets and references both on Q2 from this year, that is the immediately prior time period, and that same time period on previous years, so that you can get both the seasonality there. Presumably it's going to be the same every year, which is why year-on-year comparisons kind of spare you the entire problem, but also good to compare how things are going this year. If you want to go the extra mile, perhaps even compare how previously this year has done with previously other years, to see perhaps we are generally on plus 10% this year compared with the others. So that's what we should expect when comparing to the same period other years.
That's brilliant, thank you. Can I ask my second question?
I'm very happy for you too.
Cool. So you spoke about how you use government data sources. I was wondering which of them you use, and are they publicly available, or do you have?
We're only using publicly available data, and in that sense, the Department for Education has really been it's been a key player in terms of just the data they offer and the way that they offer, and the portal that they renewed lately is quite. It's definitely got my affection. The thing is, I don't want to go. We don't use it in a great depth just because we need to split our attention between DFE for England, Scottish Government for Scotland, or the National Centre for Education Statistics in the US. But we use those in many ways, just in terms of having a directory of schools, something as simple as measuring what our coverage is in a given, what percentage of schools in England use SumDoc. But also, as I was saying, it's interesting, particularly if you're driven by that mission, to have that socioeconomic factors. There's plenty of them. I'm sure there's people in the audience that will be much better than me at elaborating, but for example, having multiple instances of deprivation, having what's their level of fund, and I say the funding with some hesitance in terms of poorer schools may get more funding because they're poor, but then they are getting more funding. So who do you determine who needs it most? I know the most straightforward is just using achievement data for those schools and identifying those that need that extra reinforcement, regardless of their socioeconomic circumstances, regardless of their funding. If they are underperforming, the fact is they are at the bottom of the attainment gap. And the pandemic has been a bit nasty in terms of there's missing years on data, but mostly anything depends on what you do. There's going to be different parts of national government data that you may be interested in.
Oh, perfect. Thanks so much.
Okay, Francisco, there's another question here from Sofiane. Sofiane, do you want to ask this question? It's on the Octalis, or Octalis.
Octalysis. As in analysis, but with 8 parts.
Yeah, Sofiane.
Hey, yeah, I thought it was interesting because I came across it a couple of months ago with my co-founder, and we're looking to also embed it in our product. So I was wondering, I guess, how embedded is it in your product development, and who in the team is kind of pushing for it?
Good question. To be completely transparent with you, it's something that we got brought on board a few years ago by one of our now product managers. She was doing product management as a different company. They have used Octalysis intensively, and they brought that methodology into SumDoc. Initially, it was just her own part of the product that it got applied to, but it's slowly been spreading more and more throughout the company in terms of people, because it can apply to mostly anything that you want to gamify in order to increase engagement. In terms of who will be the person responsible for it, sure, I'm the one who measures it, but the one who actually uses that framework in the day-to-day work is the product designers and product managers, who take the decision on what features should the product have and in what order of priorities.
Thank you.
And we have a question from David Furlow as well. David, do you want to ask that?
Well, just I see there's obviously always a focus on attainment and achievement because it's easier to measure, but that idea of growth is it's a useful countermeasure, and the vision of the company seems to be aligned with eliminating gaps and disparities. And I just wonder, have you noticed that people that have the advantage of technology and the advantage of higher platforms and more recent operating systems and all that sort of thing, are they using your system more than the people that you actually started to have a vision about? Is that an issue that you have to pay attention to, or is it just like, okay, that goes by the board?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you. I think in terms of measuring whether that limits the gaps, the good news and bad news is that we've got a study underway right now. The bad news is that it's not fully finished, so I can't share it yet, but it will be, feel free to get in touch and I'll give some more information in terms of access to devices and the impact of that in terms of attainment gap. Definitely, and this is one that not just it's something that we've measured not just through the data. It's something that has come a lot through that more qualitative side of things. But yes, we are a platform that is used through digital devices, and the pupils who are lower in attainment gap may not coincidentally be the ones with more restricted access to devices. It's that example of the kids I was talking to at the school where they had to wait for the parents to come home because that's the only devices that they had in the house. So yes, definitely an issue, definitely one to tackle. I would like to study perhaps more systematically access to devices against that gap on our platform at a more national level. And in terms of what we do about it, I think the most direct counter to that threat to attainment gap we have is purely because within our control, we allow the app to run on pretty old versions of phones or of devices, because we are aware that many children have the luxury of choosing what devices they use to learn with Sandbox. So otherwise, as you bring up, we'd actually be helping more the ones at the top of the attainment gap.
Yeah, it's a very challenging problem. I know that some of the most amazing initiatives, code clubs, everybody loved code clubs, which was kind of coding clubs that happened after school. But unfortunately, what they discovered when they looked into them was that they were mostly frequented by kids of parents who basically had the time to, they take their kids to a club, and they would just ended up,
And perhaps just to add a point on that, I'd indicate that because there was a big rollout of devices during the pandemic, and whether they're being renewed or not, that's a different problem, but there was a big rollout. These problems perhaps more accentuated at home than it is at school. It would be expected for students to have a reasonable access to devices at school. Worst case, perhaps they need to share with other classes and have limited time. But it's when they get home that difference really becomes apparent.
Yeah,
I really like the idea that you're attacking the vision with data. So therefore, you have both the motivation and the capability to examine whether or not your target audience is gaining access to your platform. And I think that's a wonderful example of where it's not just, is it market successful? It's, is it vision successful? And you have the capability and the desire to monitor that. So I totally applaud that. I think it's really a wonderful thing. And strategizing how you can gain access for the students that don't have access but might have potential, and ultimately serving that vision of eliminating the gaps or at least minimizing them, then you're in a position to go argue for grant funding and government funding and everything else, because you're compiling the evidence that people who are already advantaged see the value in the platform. And therefore, it's a question of access for the people that don't have those advantages. So I think that's really great. And I thank you for doing it. It's like a lot of work, but I'm really glad you're doing it.
Thank you for comments.
That's wonderful. Thank you everybody for your questions. I just had one question really to add to that, and that was on you talked about there being some sort of diagnostic test when students started. Unfortunately, I can't help but ask questions about this because obviously our company does diagnostics. So I'm always kind of intrigued. With that, how long is the test? How many questions? How do you determine
that's
how far do you go?
That's another great question, because both from a data and product point of view. From a product point of view, the time that it takes has always been on our focus and our target. Among other things, because it's the first part of the platform that a student is exposed to, and you don't want to make it too daunting. You're saying play and you're going to be able to have fun and get coins and all that, and the kids are thinking, what are my coins? So we tried to, I did a study on how long it would take and whether it will be done through a single session or more than one session. And the time we've reduced it to something around the 15-minute mark, which I feel it's also got to be said that initial diagnostic is your initial placement from where the adaptivity is then going to go around and place you in the curriculum. But yes, we did that, and it's at the most perhaps like a good proportion of the cohort was finishing before 20 minutes. And particularly the one thing that was very important for us is whether most of them were finishing in a single session or they were having to leave it halfway through, come back later. And it turns out that a very good proportion, let's say 80+%, were just going through it in a single session, which at least speaks of the product being well designed towards that particular concern. I'd also mention that it can perhaps be a bit more in terms if your student is significantly above or below their expected level. What we do is before the actual diagnostic test, we give them a small pretest to see where they are, and if they are, and that pretest is assuming that they are at their, if a student in year 4 is going to be at year 4, year 3, if they're significantly below. On the one hand, it's some trouble for us in terms of product because we're going to have to repeat and iterate a bit more until we nail it down. On the other hand, it's precisely those students that are going to benefit more from the platform. So we still try to very much take them into consideration, even if they're not the majority of users.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, I completely, I'm a data person, so obviously I see the massive value in, you know, let's collect as much data as we can, because then honestly you'll enjoy it more. But unfortunately, you do need to complete some questions at the beginning. But yeah, well, a conversation for another time. But I like the idea of adaptive assessment in these situations so that you can kind of make things easier or harder as you go through, and yeah, maybe shorten times a little bit to knowledge acquisition. But well, thank you very, very much. That was a really, really fruitful discussion. And thank you again to everybody for coming as well and all your questions. It's great.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, have a good evening all.
Goodbye.
Thanks, Simon. Have a good week. Have a good evening.
Thanks.
Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, David.